So I'll preface this review by saying that I'm not that big of an Indiana Jones fan. I know the very basics of the franchise, but in terms of actually being a fan of it, that really isn't me personally. So I really did want to come at this review from a different lens that may or may not be useful to you. As someone who likes Machine Games' previous games, the games that Todd Howard has made, regardless of what you think of him, but isn't a big fan of Indiana Jones. So when I say that I really liked Indiana Jones and the Great Circle, and I'm really shocked at how the game turned out in terms of a lot of its different aspects feeling satisfying, fun to engage with as a whole package. And I really think that regardless of if you're a huge Indiana Jones fan or like me who's just kind of an outsider to the rest of the franchise at best, of course we have to talk first if there are any real barriers to entry in terms of my understanding of the story, and I really didn't feel like it had any. I feel like most people have that basic knowledge of Indiana Jones as a franchise. While it's not as big as Star Wars is or was, it still, I think, has that collective mindshare and understanding. You could argue that doesn't exist with younger generations, and I can definitely see that, but that's really Disney's fault for only really giving a few new entry points, such as Lego Indiana Jones. Maybe you could say the new movie for younger fans who don't know enough to really want to go back and watch the original films. In fact, maybe you could argue that this game acts as one of those good startup or entry points for somebody looking to get into Indiana Jones in the coming years, and I do see that perhaps it does. First things first, the graphical quality of the game was really surprising. Even as I said on the Xbox Series X, it looks great. The only real issue I had was some of the pop-in that took place in some areas. Otherwise, to see these locations in this kind of timeless way, the golden deserts of Egypt, the cobbled streets of the Vatican, etc., were rendered in a style that I thought was faithful and respectful to those locations, where it could have really been an issue if it wasn't done right. What particularly impressed me was the facial expressions and the liquid effects. I think we all know those games that have that kind of blank stare to NPCs, and if that happened in this game, especially with the cutscenes, it would be a huge issue. As I was saying, the liquid effects also were shocked in how they did them. In a lot of games I feel like this is more of an afterthought, but stuff like the sweat dripping from a character's forehead, the wine being poured into the dish, it's again these little details that do matter and indicate the quality of the experience. Onto more of the aesthetic of the game. While one could argue it goes for a more realistic aesthetic, which it definitely does and is supported with great graphical quality, it does have this timelessness to it that other games with great graphical quality with realistic aesthetics alone don't have, if you get what I'm saying. From a few years to a decade, I could definitely see people being able to come back to this game and not really having a problem adjusting to it. The different locations being in a 1937 style where all the little details fit right. Machine Games has got very good at doing this kind of thing, I think, just from the Wolfenstein games, so I can definitely see why they were able to convey these locations in such a way that it feels like the year is actually 1937. Now, the way the game handles the open world like hubs and sections is really how I'd want them to do it. There's a good mix of level-based gameplay here and open exploration. You are Indiana Jones. There will be stuff that you can go out and explore, find. The mysteries were a good source for this. Now, what they were was essentially these little puzzles that you could go out and find in the world. You find a few notes for some direction, but regardless, these optional side objectives I found most of the time were pretty well placed and cool to figure out. There isn't a whole lot to do on such a bloated, huge level, which is good. A lot of the exploration in the game I think you'll find can be completed within a good few hours in each area if you choose to engage with it, and that circles back to my main point with Indiana Jones. I think this game is how most AAA games should exist going forward. High quality, compact but meaningful experiences that can be completed within a good 10 to 20 hours of gameplay. Bloat and disrespecting the player's time is one of the worst things a dev can do in their game, so I really respect Machine Games and what they've done here. Onto each section or hub area, I found the gameplay and how actually distinct the exploration was from the different hubs was good. For example, exploring the Vatican, naturally you'll be going through different rooftops, buildings, monasteries, cathedrals, etc. A very closed experience as you're in a city here. While in comparison, I found myself luring Giza, found myself going around different mini tombs and the ruins of the place itself, especially near the pyramids. These serve as good places to have secrets and also are just great in terms of just finding a secret passage in the side of a block of sand. Sukhothai, I found myself exploring the jungle in a different way, and that was by boat this time. It was a much more measured and controlled experience in my view, because you can only really go where the boat allows you to go. Of course, you can get off the boat and jump and see different things like different crashed boats, ancient ruins, or fascist camps. One thing I thought the game did really well was how it rewarded exploration and how it really made sense here, how it was handled. See, in this game, exploring and finding different notes, relics, artifacts, books, books. Taking photos of different monuments will get you adventure points, which essentially act as the game's progression system for indie, as you are able to spend these action points on skills in the form of different books that you're also able to find via exploration. These act as buffs and bonuses for indie. These are pretty simple but can be really good, such as Lucky Hat, which while you're in Indiana Jones' classic outfit, if you're knocked down or basically dead, you could reach out, grab your hat and get another revive, which can come really handy, especially in the sections where you are found out as the enemy AI resets. I think this is a good replacement or a good way to add in a kind of progression, especially for an Indiana Jones based game. As I said, there was a few really good special books which change up the gameplay a lot. Most special books already add on to existing tools you are given as indie. A traditional skill tree type of progression I feel wouldn't have worked as well. The fact that you actually have to go out and find these books I think is the core to the experience, making it feel bold and unique. Now onto the actual gameplay, and becoming Indiana Jones is a core thing that Machine Games had to get right, because this is a new or perhaps forgotten territory in gaming, with most adventure type games focused on a third person protagonist being able to see the character in gameplay, being the viewer of the character doing all the cool stuff. So Indiana Jones being a first person experience really had the challenges of creating, or maybe to some justifying, why they made the choice to make the game like this. I thought generally they did a phenomenal job in how they put all the different systems together to create a package worth playing, especially if you're a fan of Indiana Jones as a character. I think you'll find the most to love here. Before we get into any specifics, I would just wanted to say that it actually really intrigued me how they made a kind of immersive sim-like game, or gave some immersive sim elements to it. Not fully, but definitely had that general feel of Dishonored, for example, which I loved, especially when it came to its stealth. As I said, it isn't fully an immersive sim. They do have this golden path or way they intend you to do things, but the game does accommodate you to do things like go full Nazi killing machine mode or complete stealth in enough ways that you can call it an immersive sim adjacent or light. I do want to point out some issues that I think should be ironed out by the time of this review. They aren't unfixable, but in terms of gameplay and immersion, I do have to talk about them as drops in quality of the experience. For example, there was definitely some finicky times where quick select was not as smooth as I would have liked. Some of the gameplay itself, like walking around, also could not be as responsive as I would have expected it to be. Probably one of the worst of these issues though was the transitions from cinematic to gameplay. There was a few really bad instances of this happening where it could be a nitpick, but it bothered me a lot, where I was getting into the story in some of the cutscenes and there was a hard cut or stop where you then transition into gameplay for a few seconds. The screen either goes dark or the characters and Indy just look around and stare in the same direction awkwardly. Can be a small or a big thing depending on who you are, but for me it did take me out of the experience a lot when it happened. Now onto the puzzles. A lot of this game is the puzzles. Now personally, I didn't find too many of them to be overly challenging or difficult. They definitely had some of those moments where it was just one thing missing to complete the puzzles, but the puzzles on their own wasn't a specific issue that it was difficult to understand, which I think is really good for an Indiana Jones game. The game does this thing where you feel like you're being challenged, but not enough to the point where it can be an annoyance to the gameplay. There's this kind of natural calming state to these puzzles where it all just kind of clicks together and you just go ahead and do the puzzle. If you do get stuck, you can always get out the camera later in the game and it will basically tell the puzzle to you, which is nice if you really can't find that one thing that will make the puzzle work, or worse, you don't know what the puzzle is asking you to do. One thing that I would think wasn't important was how puzzles in the tombs and ruins were handled. These are big side content or main content to the game. I feel it's important for them not to repeat certain elements across tombs, as this can really be something that breaks immersion, and I don't think they really did that at all. The most I can think of is a puzzle building off a previous puzzle's complexity, which I think is actually a very good thing to do throughout a tomb. There's obvious things like safes, locks being the same, but that's different because all safes are essentially the same. It's not like you see the same puzzle in Africa as you do in Asia for some reason. Now, onto my personal favorite aspect of the game was the combat and actually the stealth too. For me, I don't like stealth too much in games because I'm not too good at it. Getting into the combat first, the game presents you with a lot of tools to really immerse you here as Indy. Obviously, there's the whip you can use to disarm enemies, distract or grab enemies. It's a very versatile tool in all aspects, but there's also basically anything Indy can pick up can be used as a weapon, and this was a very fun aspect of stealth and combat as a whole. Picking up the guitar and a broom and then smashing some fascist or Nazi's face in the impact of these attacks is really good, which is important. You can also throw everything, which has a similar effect as well, varying degrees of success. Obviously, if you don't have anything, you can always rely on good old-fashioned fist fighting, which here feels like its own fleshed out mechanic. Usually it's an afterthought in shooters or other first-person based games. Fist fighting in Indiana Jones has the desperation feel to it. You're not some immortal guy. You can do some damage, but ultimately you are just Indiana Jones, an archaeologist. The different things you can pick up are also very prone to breaking. Naturally, you'll be switching from item to fist to whip to item around on the floor to give you the edge in a fight. The feeling of breaking a broom over a Nazi's head, knocking them out, is unmatched, I feel. Stamina is also important to think about because you'll especially be needing it in fist fights and in general trying to get away. It can be kind of annoying or limiting, but definitely makes sense because, as I said, you are just human here. The final piece to the combat I really want to talk about here is the guns, and these add some great level of insight and gameplay. Obviously, Indy has his own pistol he can shoot, but it's discouraged that the player does this, or maybe encouraged to use it as a last resort. Sound is very important here. Sure, you can go in guns blazing at points, but you doing that will basically alert everyone in the area. This especially becomes troubling when enemies start to carry some pretty powerful shotguns and rifles later on in the game, which you can also use, by the way. However, my favorite thing about guns that you don't typically see done at all is using guns as an actual melee weapon, not as the gun having a melee, actually carrying the gun and swinging the gun like a stick. I don't think I've seen a game that really does that, and it really kind of added to that immersive sim-light feeling. You can either go in with the gun as a melee weapon to avoid alerting everyone, you can go in guns blazing, or you can go in guns blazing, switch the gun when you're out of ammo to a melee weapon and hit enemies over the head with it. Now onto the stealth. It's a pretty simple way that stealth is done here, not overly challenging. The AI can be a bit dumb here or there, that's definitely true. Apart from using a gun, though, I do like how there isn't that big of a alert to being found. If someone finds you, that person finds you. You don't get a general alert going off unless a whistleblower finds you, which then everyone will be alerted, obviously. This I liked more because it allowed more of that fun gameplay that I like about stealth games, taking out enemies slowly, basically puzzle solving in its own way, taking out enemies in a nice calming order so that they never knew I was even there. Even if they do find me, I'm still relatively fine. I like the idea of costumes and disguises in the game, but I do think they could have been better fleshed out. In general, they were fine. They allowed you to enter an area you definitely couldn't as Indy dressed up as normal. But just because you're allowed doesn't mean that enemies either can't figure you out or a captain can't look at you and get suspicious of you. And I wanted the story and what I really thought of it. Again, coming from someone who's not really a big Indiana Jones fan, I found the story interesting. The mystery behind what the Great Circle is, being that kind of ultimate archaeological secret or challenge or mystery, and the ultimate reveal for what the Great Circle was, and the twists and turns the game story makes, was really something I feel we've missed a lot in games this generation. That ability to actually hook me in with a lot of strong, distinct characters. As somebody who just understands the very basics of the franchise, I thought they did a good job with Indy himself. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel Troy Baker did a great impression of Harrison Ford, and not only that, he did a great job in making him feel like how I thought Indiana Jones would be. I'll get into characters more in the final section, but again, I thought the overall cast was good in terms of being well written characters and not being overly annoying or overshadowing Indy as a main character. They instead act as good complements to his character, and we'll be getting more into that in the next section. But I don't know when this review will be released. As I am writing it right now, I just finished the game mid-December, so I don't really want to spoil the adventure because it's a good one and I think we'll be remembering it for a good few years as a standout of 2024. Finally, a carve out of the story section. I wanted to talk about this separately because, as I said, in the story section I thought the characters were really well done and I wanted to talk about them a bit more specifically. Of course, before I get into them, there will be spoilers here, so be aware, and if you want to go in blind, skip to the conclusion now, I would say. So I'll talk about the three main side characters here, really. That's Gina, Locus and Voss. There are other great side characters too in each location, but I'll refrain from talking about them in any great length here. First, I want to talk about Locus a bit because at first he's kind of poised as this threat and ominous figure throughout the game. Not only does he break into Marshall College and steal the cat mummy, he also acts as a main boss in multiple sections. You can also be seen following Indy throughout the course of the game at specific times. He's an interesting character that I thought was done really well, and slowly as we uncover more of his motivations, why does he want the secret to be locked off forever? Why is he acting as an obstacle to us here? I think once we get a clear picture of it, it makes a lot of sense, and in the end I was really happy with how his character turned out. Then there is Gina Lombardi, the journalist we cross paths with early on in the Vatican, and acts as that love interest for Indy throughout the course of the game. Looking for her sister Laura Lombardi as she disappeared, we team up with her initially, and of course it's interesting to see how Indy and her interact throughout the game, and how she's initially skeptical of him, viewing him as, in her own words, a heartless grave robber, to then being a serious love interest for Indy. I really liked how her storyline with her trying to find her sister concluded, and how she then stuck around afterwards, even more determined to find out the mystery of the Great Circle. Sometimes I feel that reason to stick around for certain characters and stories really isn't there and is forced, but I think in general she showed enough interest into the mystery at a basic level for it to be believable. She wouldn't just give up after the story arc with her sister concludes. Finally, last but definitely not least, Emmerich Voss. I felt he was probably the strongest side character of them all, as he was the main villain. Every scene with this guy is masterclass top tier. He really acts as that villain that we rarely see nowadays. He's cunning, intelligent, resourceful, evil, and he really has this commanding presence. Not in a sense that he's a very physically strong character, in a sense that once he walks into a scene, you know it's going to be a good scene. He's also an archaeologist, but unlike Indy, who, if I think I understand him correctly, does it to preserve history, to make sure knowledge and the mistakes of the past are not lost to time, and making sure powerful and significant relics of the past do not make it into the wrong hands, and acts more as a benefit to knowledge as opposed to the conquest that the Nazis and the fascists that go after these artifacts are after. Of course, there is his love of the adventure too, as a big driving force in my eyes. Voss, on the other hand, does it for the power. It's interesting because there are several moments here where he tries to reach out to Indy in an excited way, but clearly this is where the difference in motivation in the archaeology and search is its strongest, as Voss is very interested and focused on what this can do for the Nazi cause, and Indy is of course focused on just figuring out what the mystery is. But of course, the most important part of Voss's character that I think is actually much harder to get right than his cunning nature is his goofiness, and moments that are goofy with him intentionally or unintentionally. I think it's very hard to maintain both a serious and competent villain with hints of goofy or comedic moments without the poisoning of each of the aspects. It's rarely done right to where the comedic moments don't ruin the serious ones and vice versa. So I think it's these moments where you can actually question if he's actually intelligent or he's just a try-hard, over-the-top goofy guy who takes himself too seriously. You do see moments where he very cleverly outsmarts the main cast and ultimately get where he wants. To conclude this review, as usual, do I think Indiana Jones and the Great Circle is worth your time? Even for someone who isn't really into Indiana Jones, I think it can definitely act as that reintroduction or perhaps even introduction to the franchise for newer people. And also, if you're a big fan of the franchise already, then I think it's a no-brainer. $60 or $70 may be a steep ask for a lot of people, and I think that's fair. If that's the case, then I'll definitely just go tell you to get it on Game Pass, play this game. The story by itself can probably get you a good 12 hours of cinematic, high-quality movie-like experience. If you just want to completely get that, you can get the story done in a weekend or something. There's a lot of side stuff you can do though, which bumps my playthrough up to 21 hours, even if I didn't get everything. I could definitely see if you wanted to push for the secret ending, get all the notes, explore everything fully, you could definitely get a good 35 hours out of the game in a playthrough. And of course, that doesn't count if you want to go ahead and replay the game, try some different ways of playing it, maybe having a more combat-filled experience rather than a stealth-filled experience. There is that kind of replayability that I think will stand the test of time as an unbloated, it's not forced, it's a very much linear but compact, ultimately strong experience that I think a lot of AAA games can learn from moving forward. Now onto the actual score. As usual, I put the same disclaimer I put here in all my reviews for new viewers. I don't have the belief that you can have a universal score to games where all games can be rated by. So if I do choose to give a score to a game that are or will be a part of a franchise or series of games, and the score will be in context of that series of games and how well that game ultimately fills its ultimate potential. For example, for the sake of argument, I might give Dark Souls 1 a 9.3, but I might give Dark Souls 2 a 7.1 or something, but that doesn't mean that I think Dark Souls 2 is a 7 in comparison to other games. That's just how I would compare it to how it reaches its full potential, and of course it's all subjective and you can disagree, but ultimately it's how I like to review things. So how would I rate Indiana Jones and the Great Circle? I think I'd ultimately give it an 8.9. An amazing experience. I think that that could then be built on more and could clean up certain aspects to really make it that ultimate Indiana Jones experience. It had a lot to build up and shoes to fill, and I think the final game that Machine Games has crafted here is definitely one of their strongest in terms of story, gameplay, making you feel like the character. And while I do want them to return to finish up to Wolfenstein 3, I do want to kind of see them do another Indiana Jones game to see how they can build upon this very strong foundation they've set here. That's it for this review. Thank you guys so much for watching. Hope you guys enjoyed. Subscribe if you liked the review and you want to see more reviews. I have a lot on my channel. There's a lot more coming as well. I stream basically every day. Currently we're playing Fallout New Vegas, and see you guys next time. Bye.